Good afternoon, everyone. We have, I guess, a little bit less than 8 hours for you all to make sure to get to the polls today on Election Day in this highly important municipal election here in Philadelphia. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited to be joined by Andy Toy, Policy Director for the Philadelphia Association of Community Development Corporations. And so Andy's had a lot of experience in Philadelphia politics and engaging community organizations and sharing their voice. We're really excited to have him on today to talk about language access, especially for folks of limited English proficiency. So, Andy, thank you for being here. I know it's probably
Thank
good.
you. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and go out and vote if you haven't already. That's the first thing.
Awesome.
You can leave here if you want to and go vote. I wouldn't be offended.
This is streaming, so you can come back and watch this later.
Yeah.
So just a very quick, like kind of a broad overarching question. Like how is this election on both the municipal and we're electing judges as well? How is it going to impact the limited English proficiency community in Philadelphia? What are some of the issues you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think many of the issues are the same for a lot of people, such as crime and violence and guns, the opioid addiction. But in particular, I think that LEP communities are often less connected to government and to services because of language or because of their background, cultural, or even the way they look. So, it's really important that we make sure that people feel connected. And one of the ways we're connected to our government is by voting and being involved in the civic life of our communities, of our city. Another thing that a lot of the LEP communities are involved with is small businesses, because there are very few other opportunities often for people. They may be working in a very small business or working at a very low level job. So they really do need to understand how the system works. And have those opportunities that a lot of people come here to the United States and to Philadelphia to find opportunity for their family to survive and to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So how does municipal government, particularly representation, impact folks who have limited English proficiency?
Yeah, I think people need to see people that look like them, just as we know for other populations over time. That's been the mantra, and they have to feel like they can connect to the people that represent them. So they have to be able to have that line of communications. So it's not just that a person needs to be Latino or Asian, but it does help. And language is definitely a part of that, but also just your background is part of that. Yeah, and I think that we actually have just gone from a point of having 2 Korean Americans on city council to 0 as of after this election, as of now actually. And we probably have 1 Latina representative still at the end of this election, even though I think it's about 15% of the population is Latino in Philadelphia. There are 17 council people. You would figure that would be a couple people if you did it by the math. So it's important that we show that representation both in the elected officials, but not only that, but also in leadership across the board. The Kennedy administration has been a great administration for immigrants and people, immigrants and refugees, but within the administration itself, the percentages haven't been so great in terms of in the leadership position. So I think there's a lot more work to do there.
Absolutely. What about on the judicial side, in terms of fair and legal representation? You kind of talked about some of the themes on the municipal government. Are those same themes exist on the bench, up and down?
Well, I think the big election today is on the statewide level for the Supreme Court and other justices. We saw how that impacted the attempts to gerrymander our state.
Mhm.
Actually, it's been gerrymandered for a long time, but having a fair court really allows us to push back on that. So at the last election, I guess it was I forget what year it was, but when we elected a couple of justices, we actually the group I'm involved with, United Voices for Philadelphia, had the justices invited them to come speak to a very, very broad constituency to explain like what's the role of the Supreme Court, how does it affect a Philadelphian, and it was very helpful for people to understand what the role of those judges are, even though it's up at the state level. It was actually the big impact for us to be able to stop gerrymandering. And gerrymandering, as you know, Justin, as a lot of us know, is the way in which the maps are drawn to either exclude or diminish certain voters. And we've had conversations like why in Philadelphia, in fact, a few years back after the census, we were talking about how the maps would be drawn, and we said, well, you don't want to like carve communities in half. Like it would make no sense to cut a line through half of Chinatown, for example. Small community as it is, it should be stay intact as one, so that it has that kind of influence as a group, rather than trying to carve out little pieces of voters so that they have no influence at all. So it is really important. The judiciary is really important, at least on the federal level. I mean, on the state level. On the city level, I'm not as sure. That's a lot of judges. It's really hard to keep track of, honestly, even for people in the know like me.
Indeed, yeah. This is what they call a low information election, right? And so.
Yeah, and one last thing about judges, it could be, and in particular, I guess on the federal level, they could have influence over what happens to immigrants. For example, we've had some deportations of people for minor infractions in Philadelphia. In fact, I knew a guy, a person who had set up a really great family and life, and he was a barber, and he got deported, a Cambodian man, because he had committed a crime earlier in his life as a teenager, and his parents, when they came here, they did not, unfortunately, because they came as refugees, he could have been a citizen right off the bat, but they never followed through on the process, and so he was not officially a citizen when he committed the crime. Therefore, the judge basically sentenced him to deportation, and he can never come back to this country, even though he had really created a good life and a good family and a good community member. It was really unfortunate. So judges do have an influence on our lives.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about your work with the Citizens for Language Access, or even United Voices of Philadelphia, as it relates to kind of elections and making sure that access to the ballot is like language is not as big of a barrier as it can appear to be?
Yeah, I think so. If we want people to come out to vote in a big way in Philadelphia, in places like Philadelphia, where we are an important key to the Keystone State, as we saw in the 2020 election, we need to have as many people come out as possible. So every vote counts, and if we're missing some people, even a small percentage, that could tip the election, I think. So we really need to have a way to reach people, often in their language. When I was at CMAC, which is a nonprofit in Philadelphia, we did a lot of voter registration, voter outreach, nonpartisan. And what we found was we actually did and this has been proven in other places, what we found was that when we send information about the election, about what people should be voting for, not in English, but in this case, it was, I think, in Vietnamese and Chinese to two different sets of voters. and we tracked to see who came out to vote, because we can do that. We found that their participation rates were even higher than the average voter participation rates, which is really amazing because they were like first time voters, many of them. And many of them had not participated. So we know that being able to reach people in language is so important to their participation. Just basically understanding what you're voting for in general. So I think the more we're able to reach people, and particularly in language, the better. What else was I going to say? Yeah, and I think that the sense that when you live in America, you should be voting, you should be participating in the civic process.
Right.
For some people, that's a little new, I guess, but for us, it's really, really important. And if we can do what we did in that small experiment throughout the city, instead of 24%, 23, or whatever what is our
Guessing it's going to be 27%.
27?
What the primary was, but yeah.
Yeah, if we could get to 50%, Philadelphia would be way more powerful, and we would get more resources, and you and your community would actually get access to more resources, perhaps, and that's what we would stress. When I was at CMAC, we were working on a park. We said, this park, we're trying to get some city funding for the park, for this plan that we had, Mifflin Square Park, and it's a great plan. And the councilman at the time, Councilman Squilla at the time, said, well, if you can get people to come, to be engaged and to be for it, the majority of the people, I'm going to push for more funding for it. And we were very successful in getting people to come out to meetings and reaching people. It's a lot of work, but then they understood the connection between their daily lives, their quality of life, and being involved in with their elected officials and the process.
I think that's really remarkable that you were able to literally demonstrate that folks who simply have materials available to them in their preferred language, that removes barriers that otherwise, because I think in a for native English speakers, that's just something that we don't think about. We take for granted as far as our participation goes, right? So
right. It was really good to see that. And then the other thing is just reaching people more often in more ways, right? In general, just to remind them, hey, the election's tomorrow. Hey, do you know where your polling place is? Hey, are you planning to? Do you have a plan to vote?
Right.
We'll be there if. And the other thing is feeling comfortable too. So one of the things we've heard from immigrant voters and LEP voters is that they go to the polling place, and it is a foreign place. It's an unusual situation where you're going into a place and there's people sitting there and they're asked, and you have to sign in, and it can be intimidating for some people. But what we did at CMAC and what others did, like in PCBC in Chinatown and Asian Americans United, we would go to polling places and have people there to help make sure everything was good. If there were any problems that came up, but when they saw us there, it was also very comforting that they knew that they had allies polling places, especially as you maybe remember at the last election. I guess it was the last election, 2020, when there were threats of people coming into Philadelphia, like to try to block people at the polling places to check their ID and people with guns, and it was like just crazy. And we were like, what is going on with this? So we wanted to make sure that people should feel comfortable going to the polling places. It's we don't want to be like another country where you feel like you might get shot if you vote for the wrong person or something like that.
You can't share your voice, right? Absolutely. Well, that was one thing I wanted to ask you about was different strategies or methods of outreach. And so you went through some really, really compelling ones. So is there anything else that you are aware of or that other communities or organizations are doing that are really opening those doors for LEP communities?
I think, well, I have to give a shout out to the city commissioners, in particular Seth Boosting, who was actually introduced the measure that added another, I think it was six languages in addition. So one thing that we did, going back in history, after during the 2020 census, was a lot of people were pushing people to make sure that they um, filled out their census. There are a lot of people that do not actually. Surprising how many people are
Right.
afraid of filling in paperwork and government. Whether you're and the census doesn't ask whether you're documented or undocumented or anything like that, or there were homeless people that were able to fill it out as well.
Mhm.
But we worked really hard to make sure that we got that to that threshold for the Voting Rights Act. There's a 10,000 person threshold, or 5% of the population, which if you reach that, then you must put those materials and language you must have at the polling place. As you notice, when you go vote, you have Chinese as a language now, because we reached that threshold, and it wasn't by much. I think it was like less than 11,000. So we were really close to the threshold for people who needed language assistance. But we got them to participate in the census. So that was one thing, to make sure that they now have that access in language. And then the other thing is the commissioners added Russian, Vietnamese, Khmer, Arabic, Haitian Creole, and Portuguese. I think those are the six that were added in terms of outreach. They're not on you can't vote yet in those languages, but all those languages are part of like the voter guide that the commissioners put out.
Mhm.
And it really is important for people to be able to read and see in their language. One interesting thing I've noticed is that the mainstream folks don't really know that there are a lot of people out there that don't actually necessarily read English. There are in Chinese, there are at least 3 or 4 newspapers out there in the community, Vietnamese, in every language. So there's like an alternate universe of information in different languages. We need to break into that and make sure that people have what they need to be able to be informed and to feel like if you're not informed, then and you don't know nothing about it, it's less likely that you'll vote.
Mhm.
But a lot of people who have lived here their whole lives, let's say you're an African American, you understand what it took to be able to get that right, or a woman to be able to vote in the United States. It wasn't always a given.
Right.
Newer immigrants don't understand that often. They come here, they're like, well, this is not for me. I don't, I'm not, my kids might vote, but I'm not going to vote. I don't know what it means to be a participant. And they don't understand the sacrifices that many people made to get here. I'm American born, so I get that and and understand the importance. But we need to educate people about what it took to get to where we are, especially if they haven't lived in this country their whole lives, to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. These are all great things for us to continue thinking about and working towards as we welcome in a new mayor and a large number of new council members. And so I know you're busy today, Andy, so we'll let you
Yeah,
go.
one more thing I wanted to add real quick was I think it was 3 years ago, the election, or 4 years ago, whatever the election was. This is how important voting is. We actually added the permanent we made the Office of Immigrant Affairs a permanent fixture in City Hall, which Jim Kenney had it, but really we wanted to, he wanted to, and we all wanted to make sure that it was a part of city government because it is an important piece of government, and people voted for it. So, I mean, if that doesn't tell you it's important, that voting's important, it is important, and we got that in there. OIA is an important part of our government, and kudos to them for all the work they do. And I think, you know, that's part of our work, is to make sure we elevate those folks that are doing really good work out there too.
All because people turned out and voted. So
yeah,
great.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate the work that you do, and we're excited to continue working with you into 24 and beyond. So,
yeah, I think next year is going to be a big year. We need everybody in Philadelphia to come out and vote, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or Independent. I think the more people that come out in Philly, the better represented our view, what's important to us will be represented. So if we came out at 50%, Philadelphia would be the bellwether for the state. So
that's right.
That's a good. I think that's a good goal. We should aim for that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Andy. We appreciate it.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks.